I was standing in the living room at 7 in the morning, still in yesterday's shirt, holding a mug of coffee I had forgotten to drink, looking at a photograph on the bookshelf. I had not heard her come out of her room. She stood in the hallway doorway for a moment. I know this now, though I didn't know it then, watching me look at it. Then she crossed to the kitchen in her socks, poured herself a glass of water, and said, without turning around, in the calm, unhurried voice she used for everything, "You've stared at that picture before." I did not have a prepared response for this, which was a problem, because I had spent 14 months in that apartment carefully maintaining the architecture of a perfectly normal roommate arrangement. And she had just walked through the load-bearing wall with a glass of water and a single observation, and the whole thing was coming down around my mug of cold coffee. "I was thinking," I said. She turned around and looked at me. "About the picture," she said. Not a question. I looked at the photograph. She looked at me. The apartment was very quiet, in the way that apartments are quiet at 7 in the morning when something is happening that has nothing to do with the hour. "Yes," I said. She held the glass with both hands and looked at me for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she said quietly, "Me too. My name is Cal Reeves. I'm 34. I write technical documentation for a software company, manuals, process guides, the careful and invisible work of making complicated things comprehensible to people who did not build them and do not want to understand them more than necessary. I work from home 3 days a week, which seemed like a professional advantage until it meant spending 3 days a week inside 800 square feet of shared apartment with someone I had developed, against all reasonable intention, very specific feelings about. I have a desk in the corner of my room, a coffee habit that predates everything, and the domestic routine of someone who has made his peace with a certain kind of solitude. I had poor survival instincts, it turned out, where people I lived with were concerned. Jess Harlow moved in 14 months ago. The apartment was mine originally, one bedroom I used, one I didn't, and a lease that was more than one salary could justify. I found a roommate through the building's notice board, a folded card with a name, a number, and the line tidy, quiet, works odd hours. All three turned out to be accurate, which was not the problem. She was 31. She worked as a sound engineer for a recording studio on the other side of the city. Odd hours, as advertised. Some evenings and most weekend afternoons, occasionally not home until after midnight, with the particular quiet energy of someone who had been listening to other people's work all day and was now processing it. She had the kind of listening that extended into ordinary life. She heard things fully the first time, and she remembered them, which I came to notice because she would reference something I had said 2 weeks earlier in a way that made it clear she had been turning it over since. She had red hair, dark, not vivid, the color of something autumnal, and she kept it loose, mostly, except when she was working at home. When she put it up with a pencil she always lost and always found again. Her laugh came from somewhere real. She used it rarely enough that when it happened in a room I was also in, I felt it as an event. The photograph was on the shared bookshelf in the living room. It had been there since the second month. She'd put it up when she was making the place feel like hers, which I had encouraged because it was hers too, and which I had not anticipated would produce that particular photograph in that particular frame, on that particular shelf at eye level for a person standing at the kitchen counter waiting for the coffee to brew. It was a candid. Someone had taken it without her knowing. She was laughing at something off to the left of the camera, head slightly turned, slightly blurred at the edges the way candids are when the subject is moving, and the photographer is catching rather than posing. She looked entirely like herself. not a version of herself assembled for a camera. Just her. I had started looking at it somewhere around the 3rd month. I told myself, for 11 months after that it was simply what you did with a photograph on a shelf in a room you passed through several times a day. You looked at what was there. That was not a decision. That was proximity. This was the tidiest lie I've ever told myself. And I told it every morning for 11 months, which is a lot of mornings and a lot of coffee gone cold. The existing dynamic was functional, warm, carefully boundaried. We shared a kitchen and a living room, and occasionally a sofa on Sunday evenings when one or both of us had something to watch and the other drifted in and stayed. We had a system for groceries and cleaning and the temperature of the apartment, which she preferred warmer than I did and for which we had found a compromise that satisfied neither of us exactly, which is the definition of a fair arrangement. We talked. Actually talked. The kind that had weight and direction and sometimes lasted past midnight at the kitchen table with the overhead light on because neither of us had gotten up to turn on something less industrial. She told me about sessions that had gone wrong, about musicians who showed up and played something completely different from what they'd recorded and whether that was a problem or the whole point. I told her about documentation projects I was stuck on, about the particular challenge of writing instructions for people who resented needing them. She was a good listener, which was professional hazard and personal gift. And she never pretended to find something interesting that she didn't, which meant that when she was interested, I knew it was real. Somewhere around month 6, I noticed she had started leaving her pencil on my desk when she came to ask me something while she was working. Not deliberately, I thought at first. She was always losing the thing. And she'd put it down while she talked and forget it, and I'd find it later and leave it on the kitchen counter. But it kept happening. And at some point, I stopped leaving it on the counter and started leaving it on the shelf next to the photograph. And she kept taking it from there. And neither of us said anything about the system we had apparently agreed to. I have poor survival instincts. I have mentioned this. The first moment something came close to the surface was in month 8. A Saturday afternoon, both of us home. The kind of day with low gray light and rain that didn't decide whether to properly start. She was on the sofa with headphones around her neck, listening to a playback on her laptop. And I was at the kitchen table with a document I wasn't making progress on. And at some point I looked up and she was looking at me. Not at the laptop. At me. She looked back at the screen when she saw me see it. Too quickly. The way people look away when they've been somewhere they didn't plan to be found. I went back to the document. I wrote 4 words in the next hour. I have no memory of what they were. The second time was month 11. She came home late from a session, past midnight, the front door quiet the way she always made it. The hall light on because I had left it on, which I did on the nights I knew she'd be back late. Which was not something I had announced or she had acknowledged, but which was also not something either of us pretended wasn't happening. She came to the kitchen doorway. I was at the table with a book I had been reading for 45 minutes without turning a page. "You waited up," she said. "I was reading," I said. She looked at the book. She looked at me. "Cal," she said, in the tone she used when she had clocked something and was deciding whether to name it. "Go to sleep," I said. "You've been listening to other people's work for 8 hours." She was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled, small, sideways, and said good night. And I heard her door close, and I sat at the kitchen table with my book for another hour, not turning any pages. And then I went to bed. I was not fine. I was very specifically not fine. in a way that had been building for 11 months in 800 square feet, and which had no available outlet because she was my roommate, and we had a functional, warm, carefully boundaried arrangement, and I was not going to be the person who dismantled it. And then she caught me looking at the photograph. It was a Tuesday. Mid-November, the tail end of a gray week. The kind of morning where the light doesn't fully arrive. I had been up since 6, which is not unusual, and I had made coffee, which is even less unusual, and I had been standing at the counter waiting for it, and I had looked at the bookshelf, which I had been doing for 11 months, and I had been standing there still looking when she came out. She poured her water. She said what she said. And I said yes. She put the glass down. She turned fully toward me, leaning back against the counter in the way she did when she was settling in for a real conversation rather than a passing one. The apartment was the pale gray of early November morning. Outside, traffic was beginning its day, with complete indifference to what was happening in our kitchen. "It's a good picture," I said. "My friend took it," she said. I didn't know she was. I never look like that when I know a camera's there. "I know," I said. She looked at me carefully. "How do you know?" "I've seen you in photographs where you knew." I looked at the shelf. "You look like yourself in that one." She was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise, more like a door settling on its hinges. The kind of shift that means something has been confirmed. "I put it there," she said, "so I'd stop keeping it in my room." I looked at her. "It was on my nightstand," she said, "for the first few months. And then I thought..." She stopped. She looked at her glass. It seemed like a better idea to put it somewhere we both were. That sentence landed differently than anything she had said in 14 months of genuine, easy, carefully boundaried conversation. I looked at the photograph. I looked at her. I thought about pencils left on desks and hall lights left on, and a book I had not turned a page of for an hour, and the particular way she had looked away from me on a Saturday afternoon in the gray rain of month 8. I could have found an exit. The apartment provided several. The coffee that needed reheating, the document on my desk, the very full professional calendar of a man who works from home and can be in a meeting at any time. I had a practiced instinct for this kind of move. I had used it for 14 months. "Jess," I said. She looked up. "I left the hall light on," I said. "On the late nights, every one of them." I told myself it was a practical arrangement. "I know," she said. "I knew every time." "That's 14 months of evidence," I said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She looked at me steadily, in the way she listened, fully, the first time, without preparing the next thing while the current thing was still arriving. Waiting, not for me to finish, but for me to say what I actually meant. "I don't want to be careful about this anymore," I said. "I have been careful about it for 14 months inside 800 square feet, and I have run out of the square footage required to keep doing that." She looked like a woman who had been waiting for exactly that sentence and was now putting something down. "I moved the photograph," she said, "because I wanted you to see it. I wanted to see if you would." She paused. "And then you did. And you kept doing it. And I kept waiting for you to say something, and you kept..." "Being careful," I said. "Being careful," she confirmed. I crossed the kitchen. Not fast. Not the way people move when they are overriding a decision. Just the 6 steps between us. Slow enough that she had every version of the next moment available to her. And she stood where she was with the glass and didn't move away. And when I was close, she looked up at me with the expression of someone who has made her choice and is watching to see if you've made yours. I reached out and took the glass from her hands gently and set it on the counter. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay," I said. She laughed then, the real one, from somewhere unguarded, the kind she didn't give out regularly, and it filled the kitchen the way the right sound fills a room. And I felt the whole 14 months of careful dissolve into the gray November morning, like it had been waiting for exactly this temperature to let go. From somewhere in the building, a door slammed. The boiler kicked on with its customary dramatic announcement. The coffee I had forgotten about was, by this point, aggressively cold. She looked at the mug on the counter, looked at me. "You let your coffee go cold again," she said. "I was distracted," I said, "by the picture. And other things." She smiled, the small sideways one. Then she took my mug and poured it out and made me a fresh one, which was the most domestic and disarming thing anyone had ever done in my kitchen, and which I stood and watched like a person who has just understood something he should have understood a long time ago and is choosing, for once, not to file it away. 4 months later, the photograph was still on the shelf. We had talked about moving it, she had offered, once half serious, and I had said leave it. It had earned its place. She had looked at me the way she looked at things she found genuinely worth keeping, and she had left it. The pencil was on my desk most mornings now. I stopped returning it. She stopped expecting me to. That system, like most of the systems we had built in 14 months of careful arrangement, had been quietly renegotiated into something that suited us better. A year after the November morning, when her friend May, the one who had taken the photograph, asked how it had finally happened, Jess said, "He looked at that picture every morning for a year and finally ran out of excuses." I would have said, "She moved the photograph onto the shelf so I could see it, and then waited patiently for 14 months. For me to be honest about why I kept looking, which is a level of strategic patience I respect enormously and intend to mention every anniversary for the foreseeable future." We were both right. Neither of us is wrong about the other. That turned out to be the whole thing. It hadn't come from nowhere. It had been on the shelf, in plain sight, for 14 months. We'd both just been waiting for the right morning to say so. What would you have done if someone you lived with caught you looking at their photograph and told you, calmly, that they'd seen you do it before? And have you ever put something somewhere hoping a specific person would notice it, and then waited to see if they would? Tell me your story in the comments. If this one stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.